Let me ask you about what we're seeing on college campuses across the country. We just started the show with what we're seeing on Columbia. The university wants the protests to move. They're not moving. There are plans apparently in place to disrupt the convention, which happens to be in Chicago this year. And people are saying this could feel a lot like 1968. In 1968, Nixon won on the back of this idea that the Democrats were chaotic and lawless. And he used those protests to his advantage. Do you worry about what the protests could do to the Democrats' chances for re-election?
Well, let me just say, first of all, we respect the great tradition in our country of protest, freedom of speech and advocacy. And on college campuses, this has been a strong force. We also reject anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We all remember Trump's Muslim ban of people coming into the country and what that provoked in our country. So it's about freedom of expression. It's about order. So people have a right to protest, but we have to do it in a way that is safe. And each of these campuses has their own rules, and people should respect the rules as they enjoy the freedom to participate. In terms of the convention in Chicago, I was at that convention in 1968. My brother was the mayor of Baltimore at the time, Thomas D'Alessandro, and we all went with him to the convention. He was a big supporter of Bobby Kennedy, the real Bobby Kennedy, and he was heartbroken because Bobby had just been assassinated. And I had two roles. I mean, I was there with a delegation, but I was also in the park with the protesters, and you could see the provocation on both sides of it. Again, for Chicago, if they think that it's persuasive to come and disrupt the convention, I don't know who they're persuading. And again, as you said so clearly, so Richard Nixon won. And then when there was protest over the Iraq War, George Bush won. Again, not as violent as what happened in Chicago. So we just have to respect dissension and also respect order and safety for our people.
How does President Biden address it to calm things down, to make sure that there isn't a melee outside of the convention, something that could hurt his chances for re-election? Can the White House do that? Is there a way to reach the protesters who are demanding the war in Israel stop? They're demanding that U.S. stop funding Israel.
Well, there are different elements of the protest.
That's true.
I keep saying to them, what do you think about Hamas as a terrorist organization? And that's how our country regards them. What do you think about the protesters? You don't hear too much about that, but they have a legitimate concern about the humanitarian disaster that is happening in Gaza. President Biden is a strong supporter, as am I, of Israel. But he also has been, for a long time, as many of us have been, a strong supporter of a two-state solution, respectful of the needs and aspirations of the Palestinian people. He's also been the strongest advocate for humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians, which was resisted by many in the House of Representatives on the Republican side. So he has been their champion, but for some reason, and I don't know what the motivation is, they decided, Genocide Joe, this or that. And so that makes me question some of the motivation of some of them. Mostly it's spontaneous, it's organic, it's sincere, and it's to be respected. But it also has to not be anti-Semitic or anti-Israel, which could be interpreted that way. They have a right to criticize Israel, as we all do, but we also have a right to be safe as we do so.
I want to ask you about former President Donald Trump running for re-election again. Mitch McConnell was on Meet the Press over the weekend saying he stood by what he said about January 6th, stood by his vote for acquittal in the Senate on the trial. He believes Donald Trump's responsible for January 6th, but he also says he's going to support the nominee for president, which is going to be Donald Trump. He thinks Joe Biden is too dangerous. And then Bill Barr is kind of doing the same thing. He was on CNN on Friday, and he was asked about this immunity argument that Donald Trump's lawyers are making, that anything he does can be considered, or a president does, can be considered an official act, even if that means assassinating an opponent. Let me just play a little bit of what Bill Barr said about what he believes Donald Trump would not do, or would not do if he were elected again.
I remember him being very mad about that. I actually don't remember him saying executing, but I wouldn't dispute it. I mean, it doesn't sound. The president would lose his temper and say things like that. I doubt he would have actually carried it out. That's my feeling, having worked for him and seen him in action. I don't think he would actually go and kill political rivals and things like that.
He says he would hear Donald Trump say, have someone executed, I guess more than once, he says in that interview, but he doesn't believe that he would ever do that. Do you think that that's, from your experience with Donald Trump, do you think it's obviously different from his experience, rational?
Well, what do we care what Bill Barr says? What we care about is what the candidate for president of the United States says, and he says it with great bravado. He even says if you beat up if you beat up the press, I will pay for your legal fees. So, again, those who care about the Constitution and who have studied all this have said, how can you say that a president can commit an illegal act and not be accountable for it because he's no longer president? Person could do whatever he wants to do and resign, and then he's free off the hook. So this is really, I mean, if this court doesn't rule in the right way, we have real concerns about our democracy and the three branches of government. And we have to take a look at term limits for the courts or something, but that's neither here nor there. Right now, it isn't what Bill Barr's interpretation is, if he thought he heard it or didn't hear it. What it's important is what Donald Trump has said. Donald Trump is a great threat to our democracy. What is a democracy? What are the pillars? What are the pillars? A free and independent press to tell the story of what's going on, to keep everybody informed of what people are saying and doing. That transparency is essential. An independent judiciary. An independent judiciary, when they're practically threatening on TV exposure of jurors in a trial of the president or any trial, and any of that. What is an independent judiciary? It's about free and fair elections. And what do they do but suppress the vote? So there's nothing in his performance, if that's the word we'll use, what he has done, that would indicate that he cares, prioritizes, or ever valued or did anything to support a democracy. And now on the ballot saying he should have immunity from whatever he might do. I mean, really, I have sympathy and respect for everybody who votes. I'm just glad people vote. I know some of them will always reject those of us who may look different to them in leadership or the rest, and that's that. But there are those who have real legitimate concerns about immigration, globalization, innovation, and what does that mean for their job and their family's future? And we have to address those concerns. And Joe Biden is doing that, created 9 million jobs in his term in office. Donald Trump has the worst record of job loss of any president. So we just have to make sure people know.
That was a global pandemic.
He had the worst record of any president. We've had other concerns in our country. If you want to be an apologist for Donald Trump, that may be your role, but it ain't mine. And he has the worst. I don't think that anybody can accuse me of that. But let me just say, as a Speaker of the House, we put forth a $3 trillion bill. $3 trillion of investment in communities and the rest, and that stimulates the economy. I
just want to ask one more question. This one's on Speaker Mike Johnson. There's talk about a motion to vacate. If there is one, would you vote to help him save his seat? Save his speakership? I'll
take my lead from Hakeem Jeffries, our great leader. He was so masterful in how he did what he had to do in order for us to get this vote for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, all the elements of that legislation. So he's our leader, and he will make a determination. Question is, how does the Speaker, in addition to passing the bill, and I've given him credit, and I've gotten criticized for giving him credit, how does he honor the commitments that are involved there? But as I said, I'll leave that up to our Hakeem Jeffries. He's a magnificent new leader in our party, and he will give us his guidance on that.
Represents Brooklyn. Madam Speaker, thank you.
I was in Brooklyn with him last night.
Thank you very much for joining us. It's really wonderful to have you in person.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.